Hello, my name is Dr. Danjuma Gibson, and today I would like to speak with you a little bit about the concept of restoring or narrative construction. And the title of my lecture today is Restoring and the Joy of Becoming, Healing Cultural Trauma During Social Crisis. And indeed, we are in this country, in America, in a tremendous social crisis, whether we are speaking about racial conflict that we have contended with for generations, for hundreds of years, or whether we are talking about the current COVID-19 pandemic, which really requires all of us to love each other and cooperate with each other if we are going to get through this. And so, how can we talk about cultural trauma in this social crisis in a way that can bring healing? I am talking about it through the concept of restoring and the joy of becoming. Sometimes people will refer to that restoring as narrative construction. But within my work here, within my project, I am understanding cultural trauma to be a kind of internal anxiety, an internal melancholy, or an existential anxiety or stress that a group experiences when they are unable to find recognition, affirmation, dignity, and self-worth in the larger controlling narratives that governs the social contract of any community or a society. I talk about this some in my book, Psychobiography of Frederick Douglass, and this was some of what he was even dealing with in terms of cultural trauma. And how do you understand the social crisis? What is the story that is being told? In Frederick Douglass's case, we are talking about the story of slavery and the Civil War. He understood that just as much or even more important than the war was how people understood the reasons for the war, how they talked about slavery, how they talked about the North and South. Frederick Douglass understood, even back in the 1800s, that the way you understand a narrative or construct a narrative or how you story a particular history, that will affect the psyche and emotional well-being of a people. Because all of our identities, our individual identities, as well as group identities, to some extent, they are formed by narratives that we get support from, controlling narratives that we, in some ways, base our self-esteem on. And so in this lecture here, I am talking about restoring or the joy of becoming and healing cultural trauma as a kind of therapeutic response or a therapeutic reply, an indigenous response that communities can engage in as they are experiencing cultural trauma in our current environment. To do this, I would like to engage a story from the Bible as a metaphor that I think really a metaphor that I think really brings across how we can understand or how we can better understand cultural trauma, and then talk about some of the community and the indigenous therapeutics that we can engage to heal cultural trauma. And the particular story that I will engage is the story where Jesus heals a boy that has an unclean spirit, and it's found in Mark, the 9th chapter of Mark. You may be familiar with it. I'll just read a little bit of it And this is the story where there's a young boy, he's thrown down in seizures. According to the writers, they are saying he's possessed with a demon. And Jesus' disciples are trying to cast out this demon. However, they are unable to do it. And by the time Jesus arrives to the scene, there are a lot of narratives going around. The concern is not on the boy. The concern is about why the disciples could not cast out the demon. And let me read a little bit of this to you. As Jesus approaches the scene, he asks them, "What are you arguing about?" And someone from the crowd answered, "Teacher, I have brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, foams, grinds his teeth." So I think we're talking really here about some type of seizure that's taking over the boy. And so the parents say, "I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And then Jesus says, "Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. The boy was still convulsing. Jesus asks the father, "How long has this been happening?" The father says, "Since childhood." And the father says, the seizure, cast the boy into the fire and water to destroy him. And then the father says, "If you can do anything, if you can have compassion on us." And then Jesus says, "If I can, all things are possible for anyone who believes." But then the father says something very intriguing. The father says, "I believe, but help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw the crowd coming together, he rebuked the unclean spirit. He says, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out." The spirit comes out. They go by themselves. The disciples ask Jesus, "Why is it that we couldn't cast him out?" And Jesus says, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." Now, how can we relate this? How can this be a metaphor for how we can understand cultural trauma? Well, think about the social conflict that's going on as you hear this story, as you read it on your own. And then think about what is happening today. We have COVID-19. We have a disproportionate amount of infections and deaths from COVID-19 happening in Black and brown communities. We have an ongoing battle to affirm the value of Black life, of Black bodies. And not only that, but in the society we live in today, we have social media. And so there are a lot of traumatizing images that you are seeing come across your phone, your mobile device, your television. You can see the death of a George Floyd. You can see the death of an Ahmaud Arbery. You hear about the death of a Breonna Taylor that shot 8 times and killed through a door by police officers. And you ask, all for what? And that's just this year. You think of Botham Jean in 2019, a African-American male who was killed in his own apartment because a police officer mistakenly thought that they were going into their apartment. Many people have forgotten about a Tatiana Jefferson in her own home, where a police officer thought she was a burglar in her own home in Fort Worth and shot through the window and killed her in front of her nephew. And so we look at all of these narratives that are coming through social media, these narratives that we are seeing on television. My concern here is, what is the effect that these narratives that suggest either Black and brown bodies are not as valuable as white bodies, narratives that possibly suggest, what's the point? We've seen this over and over again, generation after generation. What has changed? My concern here is how all of these narratives can collude in a way where an individual is unable to see themselves in the master narrative, where they are not affirmed in the master narrative. That's at the heart of cultural trauma, where the governing narrative, where the master narrative, and many times this narrative is unconscious, where that master narrative does not affirm the value and the life of particular bodies in a particular society. So as we think about this, my concern here is about communities caring for themselves in terms of cultural trauma in the long run and using indigenous resources to accomplish this. And I'm going to tie this again to the story that I read regarding in Mark 9. So when we think about cultural trauma, I'm sure you've heard of psychological trauma. Well, that's pretty much on an individual basis where something can happen to an individual. They may have a car accident. We see this in Army veterans. There may be a wound where whatever happens, it overwhelms the systems that govern itself, that govern a person's particular self, where they don't have a way to make meaning of what's happened to them. And so they go into shock. Some people go into have PTSD. We're generally more familiar about that particular kind of trauma. Sometimes we have collective trauma. That can be geographic. That can be where a particular community suffers a natural disaster, a hurricane, something of that nature. And so in a collective trauma, that affects a community. There's group trauma, where a particular social group, we could think of refugees, we can think of immigrants, where they may, as a group, suffer a particular kind of trauma. Most people have not heard of cultural trauma, and that's what we are focusing on. Now, this is not necessarily new. Cultural trauma, more research has been coming out on that over the last 10, 15 years. I'd like to read you a few definitions from other scholars on cultural trauma, and then I'd like to present to you a particular definition of my own, and then I'm going to tie this to the biblical narrative that I just read. Jeffrey Alexander, in a chapter that he entitles Towards a Theory of Cultural Trauma, this is how he defines cultural trauma, and I quote, "Cultural trauma occurs when members of a collectivity feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, making their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways." So that's a definition from Jeffrey Alexander in his chapter, Towards a Theory of Cultural Trauma. Ron Ehrman focuses on cultural trauma from the historical context of African-American slavery. And this is how Ron Ehrman defines cultural trauma. He says, as opposed to psychological or physical trauma, and that's what I just described for you, which involves a wound and the experience of great emotional anguish by an individual, cultural trauma refers to a dramatic loss of identity and meaning, a tear in the social fabric affecting a group of people that has achieved some degree of cohesion. This is the definition of cultural trauma that I am offering up. First, let's understand some background. All people in all cultures use cultural icons or symbols, or, as I've alluded to, master narratives, accepted stories, grand narratives. Many times these narratives are conscious, but more often than not, they are unconscious. People use these symbols, these narratives, these icons as part of their emotional, spiritual, and psychological well-being. The objective truth or the accuracy of these narratives is secondary. It's really beside the point. What's important is how the narrative has been passed down intergenerationally and how the narrative is used to either prop up or tear down or bolster people's esteem and sense of self-worth. Religion is a part of this. Religion doesn't replace what I'm talking about here. And so cultural trauma occurs over time. Cultural trauma occurs over the long run, where the master narratives and stories that prop up a particular location or larger culture, when those narratives lack the depth and integrity to incorporate or grapple with the narratives of the subculture. Cultural trauma is elusive. Now, you may have lately, if you've been watching television, you may have seen or come across stories where particular people, popular politicians, well-known politicians, they have posted in Twitter or on Facebook how they have had to come to terms with suffering with some type of chronic depression as of late. You may have heard certain Black and brown politicians talking about this. I suggest that this depression that they are talking about is more about cultural trauma. And see, cultural trauma is elusive, it's pervasive, but it's a kind of chronic melancholy or an anxiety that results from these master narratives that don't prop up people's identity. It results from the degradation of individual or group subjectivity, narratives that degrade people's agency, their identity, their capacity to self-determine. And this chronic melancholy stems from an inability to identify yourself within the group or the master narrative. So I suggest that this here is what we are seeing in Mark 9. Master narratives can also, we're talking about how history is defined and how heritage is understood and defined. Once you control history, once you control heritage, that also then controls the hope for a future. So how do we understand this in terms of Mark? And then after this, I'd like to talk to you briefly about how we can use indigenous or community resources as a therapeutic to heal or to address cultural trauma. But if you notice in Mark 11, Jesus is approaching the crowd and there's a battle of narratives going on. What's the master narrative? The narrative is about why can't his disciples cast out this particular demon, or why can't his disciples heal the victim? The focus is not on the victim. The victim is the son, the father, or the parents. But the argument is with the crowd and why they can't heal, or why Jesus' disciples can't heal this particular young boy. This is what we see today, where a lot of the attention is not on those who are being victimized, whether that is by systemic racism, whether that is by people being brutalized by rogue elements of law enforcement, or people who are suffering disproportionately from COVID-19, or anyone who's suffering from that simply because we don't care enough. The focus is not on the people who are suffering. The focus is on how can we manipulate the narrative to suggest that they are really not suffering. That is what we are seeing here, I believe, here in Mark 9, in this particular story. It's where people are more concerned about the narrative than they are about people. Sometimes I'll ask my students in class in the intro to pastoral care, what's more important, your theology, your doctrine, or the person that's in front of you? And that generally will end up in some type of, I'll say, aggressive conversation Because for some people, that can be a very difficult question to answer. What's more important, the person that's in front of you, which is at the heart of cultural trauma, or the narratives that govern a particular theology? This is what we are seeing here. Now, as we look at the story of Mark 9, we don't know the particular elements of the argument, but I imagine that the father and son are coming out on the losing end of the argument, similar to what we see today. Those who are victimized, they are coming out on the losing end of the argument that governs how do we understand what's happening to us in this present moment. Now, if you remember in my definition of cultural trauma, I say it happens over the long run. Similarly, Jesus asks his father, how long has this been happening? And the father says, from childhood. And the father says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us. So we see that there's a cumulative effect. What the father is dealing with here, this narrative that says his son is not important, this narrative that says somehow his son's suffering is necessary, and arguing about why it's happening is more important, this is having a cumulative effect on this father, on the parents. And so Jesus responds, if you recall, he says, the father says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us. And Jesus responds and says, if you can. Now, many times with that response, Jesus' response says, if you can. I've heard many sermons, I've read many commentaries where people suggest when Jesus responds, if you can, he's questioning the father's doubt. I don't think that's what Jesus is doing here. I think this is what is happening. The father says to Jesus, if you can do anything, have compassion. He's saying that to Jesus because this is what the father is used to, people not having compassion. And so when Jesus responds, if you can, I think Jesus is suggesting, don't mistake me with the way society has been treating you and your family up to this point. I think that's the point Jesus is getting across. He's saying, no, with me, he's pointing to a different way where he's saying, no, it's not the narratives that matter most, it's people that matter most. And so this thing, I've heard sermon after sermon, I've read commentary after commentary, where people are saying Jesus is getting at the father's lack of faith. I think that totally misses the point. I think a traumatological read of this says that the father's response is not about a lack of faith. It's about what he's come to expect from society. He's not used to people having compassion. The father's response actually, I believe, is a powerful statement of faith when he says, I believe, but you got to help my unbelief. And this is where I think it's at the heart of cultural trauma. Over the long run, it causes those who are suffering to lose hope. It causes them not to believe that there can be a better way. So I think the father's faith is revealed in his integrity in the response to Jesus. We have to be careful about this when people, I believe especially now because of cultural trauma, when they express anger, when they express doubt. I think when theology disenfranchises people of their right to be angry, when theology disenfranchises people of their right to grieve, their right to lament, over the long run, that leads to hopelessness and nihilism, and it can be caused by the church or by erroneous theology. This is why we have to have the strength of the Father to engage in truth-telling, as opposed to engaging in a kind of political warfare of the battle of narratives. We cannot deal with COVID-19 and racial trauma by not dealing with it. That's generally what I see with clients when I see them in my therapy practice. Most people come to therapy and report, or what I am able to deduce is that they've tried to deal with their issues by not dealing with it. So how then can we use indigenous resources? I think the last point about this narrative that I will say, this biblical narrative, when Jesus and his disciples come to the side, they say, why couldn't we do it? He says, this kind only comes out by prayer. Well, what do we get from that particular statement? This kind only comes out by prayer. I will limit my comment to this. In order to pray for someone, if I am truly praying, whatever you think of prayer, whatever your particular tradition is, whatever your background, if you pray for someone, that means that you must be concerned about them, and that to some degree, you must love that person. And I am arguing that one of the therapeutics to cultural trauma is communal care for each other and loving each other there in the community to help restore the controlling narratives that has caused the cultural trauma in the first place. I think this is very important. I am a mental health practitioner. I practice psychotherapy here here in Michigan, in addition to my work in theological education. And while psychology has come a long way in terms of dealing with racism, while therapy has come a long way, we have an incredible long way to go. There is much to be desired. And many times people can find themselves in a therapeutic environment where simply the therapist doesn't understand or even doesn't believe in concepts called systemic racism or cultural trauma. And what people can find is that the very tools they are seeking out in mental health can sometimes make matters even worse, whether we're talking about an individual or a community. And so how can we then use indigenous resources to help counter the effects of cultural trauma that we're seeing in our society? I believe we can see this in the arts, in the liberal arts, in dance, in literature, in music. I think all of these cultural symbols, communities, churches, schools, we can use these communities to these tools, to give people the tools that they need, whether that's literature, the liberal arts, reading, dance. These can be sources that people use to help restore more life-giving narratives. I'd like to read a quick passage to you from Audre Lorde about the importance of this, about the importance of self-care and restoring your narrative. And this comes, this is a famous quote that you've heard from Audre Lorde probably. It comes from her book, A Burst of Light. And she says, sometimes I feel like I am living on a different star from the one I am used to calling home. It has not been a steady progression. I had to examine in my dreams, as well as in my immune function test, the devastating effects of overextension. Overextending myself is not stretching myself. I had to accept how difficult it is to monitor difference. And then she ends with this: caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. I believe this is so important when we talk about communities engaging in resources, communal resources, particularly in the liberal arts, to help themselves counter the effects of cultural narratives, of cultural trauma, and to create more life-giving narratives. I'll read a passage to you from Toni Morrison. She talks about this. Toni Morrison, in an article she wrote in The Nation magazine, she says, I am staring out of the window in an extremely dark mood, feeling helpless. Then a friend, a fellow artist, calls to wish me happy holidays. He asks, how are you? And instead of, oh, fine, and you, I blurted out the truth. Not well. Not only am I depressed, I can't seem to work to write. It's as though I am paralyzed, unable to write anything more in the novel I've begun. I've never felt this way before. But the election, and then her friend cuts her off when she says the election. I am about to explain with further detail when he interrupts, shouting, "No, no, no. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. Not when everything is fine, but in times of dread. That's our job." I have to tell you, as a mental health professional, one of the concerns I have in times like this is that people, first and foremost, they lose their sense of imagination and creativity. And that is what we need in the community when it comes to combating cultural trauma. And so while we have many activists that are out today, we have clergy people doing their job to contest the things that we are seeing, doing their job to take care of those who are suffering from COVID-19, to care for communities, doing their jobs to contest police brutality, doing their jobs to contest the systemic racism. One of my concerns is that communities are not paying attention to themselves in terms of the detrimental effects of cultural trauma. One of the things I appreciate historically as we talk about using the liberal arts as a way to combat cultural trauma is the work of philosopher Alan Locke. He was a leading intellectual in the Harlem Renaissance. He was a philosopher, but he was criticized by many of his contemporaries because they believed he didn't get into the work of resisting racism and white supremacy, that he really didn't engage that like the likes of a W.E.B. Du Bois. But Locke believed that you just couldn't battle or engage in resisting racism alone, that we were created for more than that. Locke encouraged people, and to many, he was one of the original architects of the Harlem Renaissance. He said that cultural, aesthetics, liberal arts, dance, music, beauty, all of this was just as important. Why? Because it helps people build up individual and communal subjectivity and identity, but it also helps them to create a life-giving narrative that can run counter to the hegemonic narratives that precipitate cultural trauma. And so I invite churches, communities, that in times like this, while it's important to engage in, and it's good work, activist work, the work of resistance, we have to do it. Because if we don't talk about it, if we don't do it, our children are going to pay a price. But while we are doing it, we cannot underestimate the cumulative effect of cultural trauma, the cumulative effect of seeing Black and brown bodies gunned down on television, the cumulative effect of narratives that say Black bodies don't matter, Black and brown communities don't matter, immigrant communities don't matter. We have to challenge those narratives with life-giving narratives that are not necessarily pointed towards those who would oppress, but narratives that celebrate the beauty, the love, the joy that comes from just being human beings living in community with each other. Thank you very much.